And all God's people said, greetings again in both face and voice to folks online. Thank you for those who are joining us in the webinar for your patience as we've sorted out some technical difficulties, and we're excited to have you participating now. Now, I'll jump back in. Democratic theorists and observant citizens alike worry that our understanding of political community is too thin. It lacks a robust sense of what engagement looks like, and it lacks the repertoire of robust examples and experiences of political participation. We tend to see politics as something done by the few. The average person makes their contributions sporadically as they step into the booth to cast their ballot. Or we think that politics is done in marbled hallways and grand buildings by folks who are dedicated servants making judicious decisions, or whatever this is. This reveals what the political theorist James Tolley refers to as a low-intensity understanding of politics and citizenship. He says this reproduces a structural deficit, a structural democratic deficit. In our own lives, we can add to this the challenges given by political polarization and the gravitational pull of national politics. And there seems to be little space left for mundane responses. In this kind of world, in this kind of situation, what good could possibly come from writing a letter? In what follows, I'm going to argue that writing letters can actually be quite useful. And we wrestle with, I think, in the midst of this, some different tensions pulling at us. In some senses, we are awash in strongly worded letters, and it's not clear if this is a blessing or a curse. On the one hand, we are often called upon, no, demanded to make a response. There's an expectation that as individuals and institutions, individually and collectively, we have to take a strong public position on what's happening every moment, every day, in every corner of the world. Silence is read as a sign of complacency or complicity. On the other hand, the demand to take a stand can give the image that we're being forced into this, that we're just doing it because society and norms and social pressures are requiring it. And there's a fear behind all of this, that none of it really matters. It's all just political posturing. It's all mere rhetoric. It's all window dressing on the soul and on our lives together. Well, I'm going to argue something different. I'm going to argue that political letters can go wrong and go right in interesting and important ways. And to understand that, I'm going to use Luther's guidance to analyze what good works do. Now, let me be clear what I mean when I talk about political letters. I'm going to understand political letters in a very broad sense. This will include opinion pieces, public statements, conventional correspondence, where that letter is sent to a group or an individual. In all of these forms, the political letter is shared to shape the community's deliberations and decisions about issues of common concern. Understood in this capacious way, there certainly has been a proliferation of political correspondence. Interest groups send email blasts encouraging us to write elected officials, providing clear instructions and templates. In both print and online forums, on Facebook and other places, we find shows of support and demands for resistance, proclamations on social media near and far. So what can we offer to this? Well, I want to suggest that when our letter writing goes wrong, it's because it's ordered to the wrong ends for reasons we believe are salvific, wasted, or mere exercises in pretense or hypocrisy. Exaggerated claims about our political power and misguided efforts at religiously sanctified political withdrawal will both be rejected. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to start by talking about Luther for just a moment, focusing on his understanding of good works, and I'm assuming everybody knows, but refreshers are always helpful. I'll then pivot to following the two different ways he talks about the value of good works in several places, particularly Freedom of a Christian, as he discusses good works as those things that help discipline the body against its temptations, and things that are seen as a sign, means, and medium for loving and serving the neighbor. I'll then turn to what I think are some remaining challenges about disingenuous writers and distracting letters, times when we're writing for the wrong reasons, or we should be doing something else. So, let's start with Luther, as we always should. Luther and good works. Numerous theological convictions and social realities motivated the 16th century reformers. But Martin Luther and many others were drawn together through common complaints about the church's teachings and practices surrounding salvation, and specifically, what role was to be played by divine and human actions. In the late medieval framework, human good works were seen as necessary, a piece of the larger justification puzzle. The incomplete faith given to Christians needed to be completed, perfected, or improved. Meritorious activities that included prayer, pilgrimage, and charitable service to the poor, among many others, were signs of God's charity and love, strengthening and perfecting our work in action. Good works also provided aid for the life to come, helping to make satisfaction and thereby reduce the penalties for the sins committed in this life. As we know, Luther attacked this system again and again. He insisted that justification comes through grace, as a grace through faith, a gift of God, not a reward or a goal towards which humans must labor. Indeed, Luther provocatively proclaimed that good works were themselves sinful when done with the wrong understanding and the wrong framework, done from a place of doubt about God's promises, that replaced God's accomplishments in Christ with our paltry and untrustworthy accomplishments in our daily lives. Opponents, and even some allies, found Luther's claims confusing at best and dangerously heretical at worst. A theological system like Luther's, which placed good works outside the realm of heavenly rewards and penalties, risked severing justice and goodness. It severed God's expectations for serving each other justly, and it undermined, potentially, the structure of responsibility and accountability. At a purely practical level, their worry was this would drain the motivational force that divine punishment had provided. If good works will not help you get into heaven, who's going to do them? If you get a paycheck on Friday without ever showing up for work, who's clocking in at 8 a.m. on Monday? Or maybe I'll keep the comparison closer to home. If the first day of class, Dr. Stierna says that come May, everybody gets an A, I suspect the number and quality of the papers and classroom attendance might wane. Not to cast aspersions on the quality of the students or the dedication or motivation or will, I would also be in the same boat. I recently had an interesting encounter with someone who was in charge of a chapel of a school that I attended, I won't name, and we didn't recognize each other because I wasn't the greatest at attending chapel a couple of decades ago. That was awkward. We all have different reasons for falling off. None of us are perfect. But in the midst of this, Luther insisted that good works could still be valuable and necessary. First, Luther said that good works provide the discipline that our sometimes lazy and tempted bodies need. Given the continued human struggle against sin and temptation, good works form a kind of resistance, an ongoing guidance, as we resist the tendency to not turn in that paper or not wander into chapel when we know we need to be there. Second, of course, Luther said that good works are not merely performed for our own discipline, certainly not performed to appease God's wrath, but they are performed to satisfy my neighbor's need, to make life in this world good for others. Our fragile material lives depend on the support and labor we share in community. and we do not fully comprehend why God has arranged the world in this way, we are still called to commit ourselves because God is called to work through us. Luther saw many benefits to this approach, one of which I particularly enjoy are his frequent references to what it means to do good works under the old system. He often says that in the old system, folks operated by doing good works with a, quote, servile and mercenary spirit, or sometimes he says they had mercenary eyes. I like these references for a couple of reasons. One, it's a nice window into Luther's criticism of the Swiss. I have nothing against the Swiss, here or near or far. I'm simply amused by sort of inter-European, intercultural conflict in this low-level sort of grumbling kind that I also share with my friends from Missouri and my friends in Minnesota as somebody from Iowa, which is better than either of those places, just to be clear. But in addition to these minor ethnic squabbles, Luther was deeply critical of the mercenary as a figure, as a person, who travels from place to place, fighting in wars, taking lives, killing all kinds of people for a coin here and a coin there. The realities of war and the complexities of politics go much beyond what Luther thought, but he did think, at least with our relationship with God, we ought not see ourselves this way, as hired hands, simply doing the work so we get paid, with no love, commitment, or service. Instead, Luther suggested alternative images and vision. Luther suggested that we look at our good works and our life with God as we would the life of marriage, of two people bound together in love. This is a life where all things are shared, a life where we share our debts and the gifts. And this happy exchange that makes the debts and the gifts seem a little less burdensome and a little lighter and more exciting, respectively. For all of his work, Luther wanted to relativize our work, to place it in a larger framework of our lives with God and with neighbors, where it was seen as important, valuable, necessary, but not everything that is to be said about us at the beginning, middle, or end of the day. Now, the relativization of our good works and our political lives sometimes risks being misinterpreted. It can be risked being interpreted as a dismissal of the value of our lives together. But despite caricatures to the contrary, Luther remained a committed writer and engaged member of various political communities that he crossed and those that he addressed. In lives marred and broken by sin, God has chosen, through reasons sometimes hard to grasp, to work in and through us. Seeing around him the ongoing battle between God and the devil, the swirl of goodness and evil in the world, Luther was often called upon, or called himself, to take a position on what he saw as injustices large and small. Seeing the rise of luxury goods and the fleecing of folks, Luther argued that people ought to stop enjoying such soft clothing and fine wine and make sure everybody gets bread first and foremost. Luther attacked the exalted, struck down those who were in positions of comfort, and in a theological system that tended to view the poor instrumentally and to devalue non-religious vocations, Luther championed a flattening of some hierarchies and a need to recognize the multifarious ways through which God acts in our homes, schools, businesses, and political institutions. So, I'm encouraging us to think a little bit more deeply about what it means to say that God works through our hands, and that sometimes the way that God works through our hands is when our hands take up pen or keyboard and write, speak, and take a position. I will unpack this then by moving through the two benefits I've outlined that we know Luther says are there for good works, discipline, and love of neighbor. So let's turn to discipline. I love these different images of St. Jerome. You kind of see her writing. I tend to write with my shirt on. That's not why I like them. I love how it's sort of this tortured / pensive look on his face. He's often sort of contorted in weird ways to pose for the picture. That's my inner spiritual feeling when I am often writing. So Luther invokes the language of discipline to support good works, saying they are needed to resist temptations, to train the body, to get our unruly flesh moving the way that the Spirit is trying to pull us. I don't know about you, but sometimes I find the language of discipline to be a bit burdened or make me nervous. And there are good reasons for this. In Luther's own time, there was deep reliance in pedagogical situations on rote memorization and corporeal punishment, a widely accepted 16th century practice that Luther even questioned concerning its effectiveness, having been struck across the hands and other parts more than once as a young child. In addition to this, there were monastic and spiritual disciplines through fasting, prayer, and other means that often drove people too far, to excesses that he said left some with addled minds and destitute bodies. In our own time, when we think about discipline, we might picture someone like this. Someone whose eyes are fierce, whose face is contorted in anger, and who we're pretty sure doesn't have our best interest at heart. In more rigorous academic settings, we're also been introduced to new insights since Luther's time about the subtle and complicated ways that discipline functions in our lives. We're suspicious, the way that discipline hides itself, the way that it hides itself through various modes and modalities of our lives, different institutions, different practices, and how this hiddenness allows it to function and encourages us to discipline ourselves and one another. Recognizing all of this, however, I think we can draw a distinction still between improper and proper forms of discipline. Abuse, we know, is dominating, exploitative, and rightly condemned. Whereas the kind of training that goes into learning a new language, like sprucing up one's German to understand Luther a little bit better, expanding our list of pronoun options, and we're not used to doing that or speaking in that way. Perhaps playing a musical instrument, as we'll hear some piano, I suspect, when chapel comes around. Times are needed for disciplining ourselves and disciplining each other. Conceptual distinctions on the page can be easier than applied judgments in particular cases. But of course, conflict and difficulty do not always signal indoctrination or injustice. Luther, as I said, approaches discipline as a necessary piece of this ongoing struggle, the inner conflict and tension of our lives. And at times, I must admit, Luther's metaphors and examples easily confuse and tempt me. Luther often talks about good works springing from faith, and sort of a spontaneity, he says. I don't know about you, but I don't often find my good works as bouncy as that. It makes one wonder why good works aren't springing the way you expect them to, why they aren't coming so smoothly and naturally. Luther draws this distinction to contrast life under grace versus life under condemnation, where justification is given versus where justification is earned. To mark that distinction, the language of good works springing is helpful. To mark how what I'm supposed to do this day isn't always that helpful to me. Luther also, as you know, likes to use images drawn from agrarian life as best he understands it, making reference to good fruit that appears on good trees. A couple of years ago, after I moved to Minnesota, we discovered our home had a nice little garden in the back that had gone ill-used for a couple of years. So I thought I was going to do some planting. I'm from Iowa. We grow a lot of things in Iowa. Certainly I can grow things in this little vegetable garden, 10 feet by 5 feet. This will be nothing. What was nothing was the fruit of my harvest. I thought I planted tomatoes and cucumbers and Brussels sprouts, and I harvested thistles and other things. At the end of that first year and into the second, I would tell my neighbors I was engaged in a prairie restoration project. Fruit as anybody who actually knows how to engage in agrarian life, doesn't always come easily. Fruit of the field, fruit of the tree, the fruit of good works in our lives also takes labor and training, guidance and years of practice, a few seasons of thistles before hopefully you get that one sweet tomato. And you wonder how you've eaten tomatoes at the grocery store at any point in your life. This personal and social labor means we have to put in the work to instruct ourselves and engage in dialogue with others. Luther was often quite critical of those who he thought weren't doing the work, who were seeing Luther and other reformers out in the public light, getting attention and honor, and they wanted to jump in and do the same thing without having done the same work. When we miss this part, the hard work, we miss how complicated this is. Many times Jesus liked to tell people that he was going to interpret what was done before, what was being said now. But he never quite explained how he got from point A to point B. How did you arrive at those conclusions? Why this practice, this moment, here and now? And then many times when we talk about our works of service and our good works, we do so in ways that highlight their beauty and their goodness in glossy images like this. Doesn't service look great? Everyone's smiling, they're racially and ethnically diverse. Everything's going so well. When anybody with half a mind knows that work is actually dirty and sweaty and difficult. So, in a similar way, I think we ought to understand the work of writing letters and political letters as sweaty and difficult. Not as something easily done by copying what others are doing, by standing out there and taking a statement based on whatever pops in one's mind first, but doing the hard work and hard labor needed to both write the letter and know what in the world we're even writing about. The kind of labor this entails means sticking with what is diligent and hard, and it might seem more of a chore than a blessing. But in this sense, political letter writing fits into what democratic life is like more generally. The political theorist and philosopher Michael Walzer talks about this in defending the value of what he calls scut work as necessary and distinct from the loftier moments of political deliberation. We often like to think about political decisions happening around a table where folks are smiling or drinking a beverage. But in reality, it happens in times and places when folks are setting up tables, moving around chairs, pouring coffee, burning their hand on the urn, day in and day out. Elections, policy decisions, all of this is only possible against a much larger and often overlooked backdrop of less exciting but deeply important actions performed by people who don't get interviewed on the evening news. In those disciplined and diligent moments of hard work, we hope to think together about our life together, to think about what it means to be serving. In this sense, then, deliberation happens as we consider our reasons for doing this hard work day in and day out. The political philosopher Joshua Cohen has written deeply and helpfully on what it means for us to engage in this deliberative work day in and day out in order to create a flourishing deliberative democracy. Cohen says, quote, "When properly conducted then, democratic politics involves public deliberation focused on the common good, and it shapes the identity and interests of citizens that contribute to the formation of a public's conception of the common good." Because we tend to our own narrow, limited views about the world, our shared work and knowledge are needed to bring in viewpoints and perspectives from those laboring in other fields. We need to get over our cognitive nearsightedness, the limited tools we have to solve problems, and look for ways that others are offering their tools to solve problems as well. And there's an important discipline to be noted here as well. Sometimes when wrestling with what to say about a political issue or a subject, Luther came to understand that he actually didn't know what to say. There were times when he questioned his own abilities and deficiencies. He hadn't been to court, the ruler's court, hanging out down with Frederick and other people. He wasn't writing laws. He had, not gone to law school against his dad's wishes. And so he had to rely on those who he believed possessed greater expertise in areas like jurisprudence and government, the particular legal reasoning or the day-to-day workings of the government. So, Luther, a man rarely short for words, recognized when his own words fell short. There is a discipline here in acknowledging one's limitations and offering names of those we think are in a better position to speak. I believe this is something as valuable in Luther's time as it is in ours. Now, focusing on our knowledge, its capacities and lacks, our reasoning and abilities, doesn't mean that all of this discipline is intellectual. Political writing also needs to discipline the hearts of both authors and audiences, moving will and rousing emotions. Technical competence helps speaks to the potential impact of a building project. What are the local traffic patterns going to be? What's going to happen with the watershed and the environment? But the sharing of stories and personal experiences is also necessary. Stories and images describe our fears about rising rents. They describe our joys about communal green spaces being protected. We can and should train ourselves to better express these emotions, these experiences, and we can and should train ourselves to better grasp and receive the emotions that others are offering. As Birgit Stolt and others have shown, Luther's own writing constantly identified how mind and heart connect, pointing to the importance of moving people through rhetoric and proclamation. This suggests that Luther's concern with pride and our heads getting too far might also be seen in connection with the dangers of despair and our hearts sinking too low. Justin Nickel has convincingly argued that this is a key feature often missed in Luther's preaching. Furthermore, Simeon Zoll has argued that all this attention to the heart is a part of Luther's training and a part of his legacy, using the phrase effective Augustinianism to describe what Luther is about. This means that Luther's, quote, most important ideas flowed not least out of a conviction that the heart and its affections, rather than the ratio, are the most powerful and theologically significant part of the human person, end quote. In disciplining ourselves to write and to receive what others have written, to share and take in what others have shared with us, we come to see the value of putting words, images, and expressions to our emotions and circulating them like the blood around the heart. Now, sometimes when Luther did this, he didn't always do the greatest job. Emotions are important, but they are complex, and this is even more true when emotions are involved in charged political contexts. In the case of political anger, for example, embracing frustration and rage can deform our critical judgments, demonizing opponents, and sparking violence against bodies and reputations. Luther sometimes here provides a negative example. He was undisciplined, falling prey to his own polemical temptations. As Landau Roper points out, Luther often postured himself as a father figure, offering discipline and paternal advice to others through private and public writings. But Luther's obligation to care for evangelical truths and Christian communities led to an expectation that he remain vigorous and brave, not weak or flaccid. She says, one senses that as Luther grew older, Luther's periodic rages gave him back something of the sense of being alive, able to defend himself, enabling him to relive the kind of vitality he had felt when he was under attack at Worms, his life on the line in front of emperor and empire. Roper's observations suggest that Luther was embedded in problematic forms of gendered thinking and patriarchal masculine tropes as he waved his angry quill. While it might be anachronistic to apply the term toxic masculinity to Luther and other reformers, When the label fits, we'll just leave it there. Luther needed to be more disciplined, to be on guard against his misplaced rage, covered in the cloak of the need to defend and protect those around him and the core beliefs God had shown him. We too need to be disciplined against the misplaced rage that spreads toxicity in our public posturing and public letters. Of course, if too much anger is a problem, so is too little. Denying the feelings is dangerous in other ways, a devaluation of human affections that supports ignorance and inattention. This is particularly problematic when we dismiss people as being too emotional. Anger, rightly understood and rightly disciplined in our political writing, can be useful in that it creates a space and calls attention to pain and injustice. McAllister Bell, for example, building on feminist thought, argues that anger is virtuous for instrumental and non-instrumental reasons, because it's fitting and appropriate to the situation, or when a person loves the good and hates what is evil. She says, anger sometimes involves expressing the victim's integrity, respect for the object of her anger, and commitment to the moral standards in question. Finally, I would add that in the face of racism and other forms of injustice, Maisha Cherry has helpfully taught us that we need a nuanced evaluation and an appreciation of anger's different forms. Sometimes anger is narcissistic, she says. Sometimes it's rogue. Sometimes it's resistance, resentment, or needed Lordian-style rage. If we focus on disciplining our work of letter writing as a good work and a mode of political engagement, we'll see it in the larger place that it serves in the relationships we have with ourselves, our ideas, our emotions, and others. Now, writing letters and good works in general aren't just about disciplining ourselves. They're also about serving those who aren't us. So I'll turn now to ways that I can see letter writing serving as an invitation towards loving the neighbor. In Luther's dialectic of freedom and duty, a liberation from the requirement is paired with a requirement to serve. We are directed toward the larger web of relationships and needs shared in community. And political letters are one way, one good work that we can serve these relationships. I believe this can happen in a couple of different ways. In one sense, letter writing gives what my neighbor needs in the ways that I attend to their mutual well-being and the material resources that they require. We write letters about things that people are in need of: food, clothing, housing, access to the ballot box, the opportunity to receive life-saving and necessary medical care, especially for women in our society today. Sometimes we are writing about the things that people need us to write about, speaking as best we can to the things that are best for others. I think this is easy to see. What I want to add to this is that even the act and mode of letter writing itself is something that we and our neighbor both need together. And to get at this, I want us to think about the ways that letter writing might be a kind of invitation towards living in relationship in love. To make this case, I'm drawing here on the work of the philosopher Anthony Lawden, pictured there. Lawden has written extensively about reasoning, philosophy, public deliberation, and he's argued that reasoning itself is best understood as a social practice that is, quote, norm-governed, reciprocal, and revisable. Lawden makes the case that reasoning together in community ought to be understood more as an invitation than as a command. Sometimes commands are necessary. If you're stepping on my foot as we mill about here having lunch afterwards, I might say, get off my foot. You could read that as an invitation. If I'm in a lot of pain, it's definitely a command. I need you to do something. What you're doing is not right. I have the authority and standing to ask you to please stop standing on my foot. And there are times in the church and in classrooms and all kinds of political communities when we do rightly give commands to each other. There's a time when I have to tell you to do something, and I need you to listen. Lauden points out that as we give commands, we aren't always inviting folks to understand our reasons. I'm not taking the time to bring you along to how I see things, to what's behind what I'm saying in this moment. At times, it's not appropriate to question the commands or the reasoning others have. They might know things that we don't know, have access to information, concerns about privacy and confidentiality that they can't share. Now, of course, even here, there's accountability. There are larger structures, responsibilities, all this built into the system. But commands stand and ask to be obeyed, and if they're not, we expect reasons for that. On the different side, though, invitations function not like commands. Invitations come with the hope that someone might respond, and the hope that they can share in our thoughts and our judgments. We expect we might be able to understand what it means to say that this thing is good. And there's an openness to you saying, this isn't good for you right here, right now, in this place and time. And so I think we ought to see political letters as invitations to reason and to feel together. We share our views on the issues we take to be weighty, offering insights and experiences in the hopes that others will take our insights and experiences forward. Invitations are offered against a backdrop of relationships. We are not surprised when family and friends invite us to their table because they're family and friends. We want to share a meal or a conversation. Sometimes we invite people we don't have a thick connection to, but we hope the invitation itself will give us a chance that sharing a meal might provoke tokens of appreciation and opportunities to develop this relationship further. And when our invitations are not accepted, we expect a polite response, a response of some kind that acknowledges the offer and provides reasons why it's being declined. Depending on the relationship we share and the perceived importance of the invitation, different reasons are accepted. A dentist appointment will suffice if you can't make it to our weekly breakfast conversation. Regular gum health is not a good excuse for skipping your sibling's wedding. In the midst of this reciprocity, then, invitations and rejections, accepting and declining, all of this, I think, mirrors how our political lives and our political letters ought to be sent and seen. When the matter at hand is of relatively minor importance, we can understand and accept pretty easily the reasons for declining the invitation. The risk of offense and pain is low. On many political issues, policy decisions, we might agree to disagree. What's the best option for this piece of land? Should it be more housing for those who are in deep need? Should it be more green space for a world that is also in deep need? At any given moment, there could be different answers. I can disagree fervently, but recognize that your human dignity and my identity aren't tied up to this. At other points, however, it becomes a little harder. When the invitation concerns weighty matters, issues that are, in fact, basic to my identity, my dignity, and the rights of others, I will not accept your polite rejection. You need weighty reasons to reject the weight of this invitation. And so if you dismiss my political letters, my experiences, my positions, my feelings, my stories, and the feelings and stories of others for the thinnest of excuses, there's something wrong with our relationship. In this sense, then, political writing and our lives together in community is something that we as Lutherans following Luther are actually quite well trained to be doing, hopefully. We know so how precarious and open to rejection, the invitation can be in the gospel. The proclamation from pulpit or from street corner, whatever community we move in, whatever space we inhabit. We do our best. We offer our best reasons, gather up our best examples, put forward our best images and metaphors, and put them out there, hoping folks will pick them up and respond. And sometimes they don't. And so we keep climbing the pulpit or walking into that space, standing on the street corner or next to our neighbor at that table, keep offering that invitation, limiting ourselves to not using coercive power, to not forcing, commanding, or demanding. Because we know the gospel works best, works only, when those things aren't present. And as Joshua Cohen observes, the same is true for democratic arrangements. Quote, social arrangements are better able to elicit voluntary cooperation, and these have both moral and practical advantages over more coercive options. All of this requires a bit of endurance, I think. Patience. This does not mean we are silently suffering, sitting on the sidelines, just saying the same thing over and over and over again. But instead, we are continuing to struggle, seeing ourselves as a citizen who has worthy things to say and asking others to receive us as such. As Russell Bentley and David Owen describe, quote, the citizen who endures needs to recognize that to be heard at all means to be heard by those who participate in political discourse. And therefore, the citizen must struggle to find ways of expressing their political voice to that particular audience, end quote. In writing with and to each other, we struggle again and again. One challenge that's harder to answer, though, in the midst of this struggle, is when we're struggling with those who really aren't committed to the struggle at all. And so my last section here, I'll touch briefly on some challenges that I think remain when we're trying to write with and alongside those who are disingenuous or too easily distracted. When I endure, when my invitations are declined, I do so for reasons of substance and commitment. But when your response and my reasons for writing are themselves under question, it becomes harder to know what to do. This happens when our motivations and sincerity are called into question, when the invitation to think or feel together is seen as empty or false. If you invite me to your birthday party, but I sense you really don't want me to come, you have ulterior motives, your parents are making you, I won't really feel all that invited to participate, and the whole situation will appear somewhat corrupted. A similar phenomenon is at work when our political letters and statements are seen as mere pretense, performances of concern or outrage, superficial at best, hypocritical disguises at worst. Fortunately, Luther is helpful here as well. Luther insisted that good works in his time had fallen into idolatry and hypocrisy, varieties of falsehood that trapped and ensnared Christian consciences. Water break. You have to be careful, though, with the language of hypocrisy. Sometimes interpreters of Luther love to run to the hypocrisy shout and shout it just as loud. The problem with this is that if everything is hypocrisy, then the charge of hypocrisy itself is also hypocritical and not terribly useful as a term or critique. In the case of Luther's time and ours, hypocrisy meant and should mean something a little bit different. One of the concerns people have today with hypocrisy and our political performance is that we're just doing it for the sake of appearing to be someone who cares about these issues. We've taken off the afternoon to make a sign, to get ourselves all gussied up in clothes that look like we're ready to go protest. But later on, we're just going to go home and do something else. On the way here last night, I saw a story on HuffPost, actually, linking to a journal article saying something to the effect that those who rank themselves as strong allies on LGBTQ issues, 10 out of 10, of those 10 out of 10 folks, like 30% of them said they wouldn't want to have a neighbor live next door who was queer or other. That seems problematic. And so the concern then is that we're just wanting to be seen a certain way. There's no depth, there's nothing there. In addition, Luther's criticism of hypocrisy and falseness, however, dug a little bit deeper than just this conflict in our motivations. When pressed, he wanted to look more closely at why it is that folks aren't doing the things which are expected of them, why it is that things seem so false. And one place he often does this that I appreciate is in his very critique of rulers themselves. Luther complains that most rulers are garbage. He puts it differently and worse, but we'll say garbage. A good ruler is a rare bird, hard to see, exotic, and not usually spotted in the common peasant agrarian lands of Saxony. Luther didn't raise this criticism just because he thought everybody was a hypocrite or all rulers are necessarily bad. At his best, he dug down deeper into the reasons why rulers are bad. He said rulers often don't look to God. They look to themselves. They trust in their own power, their own might, their own abilities, and give no concern to what God might want or what other strength and source of support might be needed. He says most rulers live lives of luxury, and they grow up this way, eating fine food, wearing soft clothing, just like the Swiss or the Italians, anybody who's not Luther. And because of this, they aren't ready to put in the hard work. They expect to receive good things for little effort. Rulers are poorly trained, he said. They're kids who get their position because their dad or mom or somebody else happened to be the one in charge, and so they learn how to hunt and have parties, not how to talk to peasants or understand the best solution for who should get to farm what land or hunt in what forest. He often thinks, though, that even the good rulers like King David or Frederick the Wise, not Henry VIII, even when they're well-trained, they find themselves with inadequate help. They don't have people who will give them honest advice or counsel. The people making political statements lack depth, lack clarity, lack foresight, lack the courage needed to say what has to be said because they want to keep getting their paycheck and having their bellies filled. He often thinks that one of the reasons rulers are bad is because the people they rule are bad. I know no pastor has ever said that, or no parishioner about their council or bishop or whoever else. But Luther's sense is that even with the best of skills and abilities, the people you're working with won't always work with you. They won't be ready to serve. They won't be able. They'll be looking out for their own interests, like so many of us are so much of the time. Finally, he thinks that, quite frankly, sometimes being in a good political situation is pure fortune and luck. Who knows why God is doing what God is doing? Sometimes things work out, and sometimes they don't. Luther's other insights are also helpful here. A complaint Luther often makes of people is that they are engaged in all kinds of busy work. All of the good works he criticized in his own time, he felt were self-imposed, not required by God, and not needed by neighbor, and they were laborious, onerous. And he invokes the language of the Greek concept of polypragmosune, somebody who is a busybody or who's busy doing all kinds of things. His sense is that our time is limited. And so sometimes we waste our time doing insignificant things that aren't actually helping. He often liked to compare people like this to the bumblebee, because he thought the bumblebee didn't actually get honey. They just stole it from other people, other hives. Not true, but it works for a metaphor for him. The bumblebee sort of buzzes about, flittering here and there, but not actually doing any work that needs to be done. I don't know about any of you, but I suspect that I sometimes fritter about, not doing any work that needs to be done. Anyone who has spent their time crafting a beautiful email to avoid cleaning a disgusting mess in the kitchen or on their desk might feel slightly convicted here as well. Sometimes our neighbors would simply love it if we crafted a beautiful letter. Sometimes they would love it if we wouldn't. This doesn't mean that political letters aren't valuable. They're not a waste of time. They're just not the only way we can spend our time together. When someone criticizes us, accuses us of hypocrisy, of simply performative allyship, wanting to be seen as someone who's committed to good work, we have to pause then and ask where this criticism is coming from. It is a blanket attack fueled by rage, it's undisciplined. Is it a generic attack that all writing is hypocrisy? These we might dismiss if our intentions and actions are good. At the same time, we might receive their criticisms well if their criticisms are well pointed, and we ought to be doing other things. Iris Marion Young, the late political philosopher, identifies a danger with our tendency towards deliberative activities, things like reading and writing, talking and chatting. She says these, quote, tend to confer legitimacy on existing institutions and effectively silence real dissent. In contrast, she suggests activists of protest, boycott, and disruption are most appropriate for getting citizens to think seriously about what until then they may have found normal and acceptable. Our writing can function in different ways. It can seek to calm and create space for technical difficulties. It can slow reflection and anger, or fuel rage when it's required. Letters can attack, provoke, or challenge. What's needed then is a community with the practical and prudential wisdom to help us sort out which one of these situations we stand in, when to write, how to write, and how the work of letter writing is but one of the good works that responds to the neighbor's need. It is my hope that those of us who are trained in Luther, following his example, can do this work together. Now, I've not given you, and I don't have anywhere here in my notes, a list of all the times that you should or shouldn't write, or what should or shouldn't be said. But to do this would miss the point entirely. Deciding in advance what topics are risky or not, what people are permitted to speak, and when. Instead, I think we ought to see good works, political letters, like any good work, that have better and worse reasons for being done. They're not salvific. They're not efforts that will justify us individually or institutionally. Seen in this way, the value of political writing becomes perverted, just like any good work does. However, when political writing is seen as unnecessary, outside the boundaries of the church's work, outside the realm of spiritual jurisdiction, then the work that God does, God's work in our hands, becomes perverted. There remains an attention that I hope is fruitful, where we have neither blessed assurance nor cynical withdrawal. Letters, then, are one way we manage this tension and risk. And we do risk being right and wrong in political communities. We take a stand. We say what we believe, what we've seen, what we've experienced. We make ourselves vulnerable to others in so doing, and make ourselves accountable to others in so doing. When I write, I'm asking you to hold me accountable to what I've said, to see that I follow through my passions and commitments, that I'm not just firing off treatises and then running off to hide in some castle, but that I'm getting back into the mix of things, getting my hands and knees dirty, wiping sweat off my brow, and sometimes just shutting up to let someone else talk who needs to. Now, folks might wonder why we need Lutherans to be doing this work. I've pointed to Luther because I assume that everyone watching or listening is drawn to Luther for some of the same reasons that I am. And as Lutherans, Luther has some kind of authority. But I want to suggest that the world also needs what we have to offer from our Lutheran perspective. We know that anything can be sinful, and most anything can be blessed. But God can work through some angry, somewhat toxic German man who said horrible things and did wonderful things. And so the pull, the tendency, the invitation or the demand to condemn or bless any one person, any one group, any one letter or statement is one that we, best of all, ought to resist. Luther knew that freedom reduced anxiety but didn't remove responsibility. In fact, it heightened the freedom to acknowledge our failure and to fail together. Sometimes Luther said beautiful things about ending injustice. Sometimes he said things that invited the death and slaughter of peasants. Sometimes he admitted he didn't know what he was saying, and he wrote anyway, and the results were still mixed, as when he encouraged Philip of Hesse to maybe take a second wife. The details, the decisions are complicated, and they're important. And they're details and decisions we get at when we put pen to page or word to website. This talk has been an invitation to consider that charge placed before us, to see ourselves as charged, as writing to others from perspective that they need to hear, and listening to others when we need to hear them. I hope you've seen this talk today as an invitation to write more. I invite your responses. Thank you.